Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I'm so grateful to be here. It means so much to me that the community itself that I'm writing about, their descendants, are interested. And just before I begin, I want to point out that it is the community that largely made the work possible, because they are the ones that preserved over the centuries the documents on which the book is focused. So David, if you could just confirm that I have screen shared.
Yes.
You do, but could you make it full screen?
Okay, I'll try to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can do that on, okay. I think I can do it by...
Just if you go to the bottom of the PowerPoint.
Bottom of it?
The screen. Just down, no, I mean down a bit. Right. That one.
Yep. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right. So I will begin.
Yes. Okay.
The book departs from earlier work on Jews in the Americas, in that the starting point is not North America. Since the late 19th century and really the mid 20th century, most Jewish historians have started the story in North America. And that is because the United States was becoming a world power after World War II and the largest Jewish community in the world. What I wanted to do with this book is to change the focus and start the inquiry from the Caribbean, because in the Caribbean, in early modernity, the heartland of the Atlantic Jewish community was there, and it was not in North America. Also, the community of Suriname was part of a seamless unit constituting what historians call the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world includes North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. But rather than a region, historians understand it as a seamless unit wherein occurred interaction on a daily basis and exchange of human populations, goods, diseases, ideas, technology. And I wanted to locate the story within that historiographical framework of the Atlantic world. So I'll be using that word a lot, historiography, by which I mean the history of history writing. And I was very conscious of what people before me, professional historians and lay historians, had said, and how that was affecting my work, and also how I wanted to differ from that. So let's just, because I assume no prior knowledge, I like to share this slide. And very often in the Anglo-speaking world, many people don't know where Suriname is, that it is actually part of the Caribbean, but it is located in South America, and the Jewish community of Suriname constituted the only early modern Jewish community of South America that had any kind of longevity. So Suriname is the brown-colored country just north of the blue-colored country of Brazil, and it's in between Guyana, the former British Guyana, and the current French Guyana. Suriname was under English rule. It was first colonized by England in 1651. That was the first European colonization of the region. And it fell to the Dutch in 1667. So the story of today unfolds for the most part under Dutch rule. And Suriname, of course, became an independent republic in 1975. My starting point for the book was something that I kept reading over and over in the literature beginning in the late 19th century. And that gave Suriname and its Jewish community a mythical status. And from this literature written by lay Jewish historians and also increasingly professional Jewish historians, I read that the Jewish community of Suriname was an outlier in the Atlantic world and indeed in world Jewry. First of all, because the people there earned their livelihood through agriculture and primarily, and not primarily through commerce. So they lived in the countryside, in the plantation region. Secondly, the majority of these Jews were what historians today call Sephardic Jews. They themselves identified as Portuguese Jews, sometimes as Spanish and Portuguese Jews, just like the Bevis Mark Synagogue and other congregations. But historians today tend to call them Sephardic Jews. And actually, in my book, I explain why we should avoid using that word. It's actually ahistorical. And that is why I opted to call this community the Portuguese Jewish community. So there was an Ashkenazi Jewish community in Suriname, but it was smaller, and it was not the leading Jewish community. It was not the community responsible for accessing the privileges, for negotiating the privileges of the Jewish community from the colonial government and from the metropolitan authorities. So really, this was a time period of Portuguese Jewish hegemony in the Atlantic Jewish world. I also kept reading that this community of Jews in Suriname enjoyed unparalleled privileges. They were supposedly the freest Jewish community in the Atlantic world, and perhaps anywhere in the early modern world. And these privileges included the privilege of using their own native language, which was Portuguese, and secondarily Spanish. And of course, for ritual use, it was Hebrew and Aramaic. The privilege of owning property, the privilege of having their own tribunal, their own court. And if you melt it all down, what they were experiencing was not a state within a state, but rather a government within a government. So the Jewish community of Suriname had its own government. And of course, this was a government secondary to the colonial powers and the metropolitan powers of the Dutch world, but it was very autonomous. And according to these historians, its autonomy was unparalleled in the Atlantic Jewish world and perhaps overall globally in the Jewish world. And finally, one of that privileges that these Jews enjoyed, as I said before, the privilege to own property, so that is movable and immovable property. And as we know, of course, during that era, human beings were property. Enslaved human beings were considered legal property. And so Jews they enjoyed the privilege of owning enslaved people. These are people primarily from the west coast of Africa, but also a number of indigenous groups came to be owned by Jews. And they also had the privilege, that is the Jews, of converting select people from the enslaved community to Judaism. So these are the myths that I brought with me to the project. And because I tend to be very skeptical about a lot of things people tell me, I wondered if I could prove that the myths needed to be tweaked or were completely untrue. And I set out to do that by borrowing from this burgeoning field of Atlantic history, which came of age in the 1990s. Here in the United States, it's actually been more developed than anywhere else, but now there are Atlantic historians all over the world working within an Atlantic historical paradigm. And I thought, what if I used this paradigm, which focuses on intense interaction and exchange, and what if I tried to give Atlantic history a Jewish tweak? What would that look like? What would an Atlantic Jewish history look like? So I started from the premise that that first of all, we have to center slavery when we're dealing with any Atlantic Jewish community. So the involuntary transport of millions of people from West Africa was absolutely central to the economy, to many of the discrete economies of the Americas and in general of the Atlantic world. And so I noted that the largest slave societies were agrarian, and Suriname actually was overqualified as a slave society. Here I'm introducing a term that historians have coined, the concept of the slave society. The slave society is a society whose economy is heavily based on free labor. And were the enslaved people suddenly to disappear because they were massacred or liberated from slavery or expelled, the colony would economically collapse. The entire economy of the colony would collapse. And most historians agree that for a society to qualify as a slave society, about 1/3 of the population needs to be enslaved. In Suriname, which is overqualified for the slave society label, well over 90% of the population was enslaved by the mid to late 18th century. The other aspect of a slave society is that slavery affects every corner of life, every aspect of life, not just the economy, although primarily, arguably, the economy, but also the way people spoke, the way they dressed, the foods they ate, the way they engaged in sexual intercourse, the way that children played, the way that elders disciplined their charges. All of the aspects of society were directly impacted by slavery. Next, I noted that this community was a Portuguese Jewish community. They never called themselves Sephardic, and there's a reason for that. I realized that the Jewish community created in Suriname was actually a branch of the Portuguese seaborne empire. And what makes Suriname very interesting is that Jews retained this Portuguese identity and this affinity with the Portuguese crown, even after their commercial networks with the far-flung Portuguese empire had begun to unravel and disappeared. So Jews continued to identify as arguably as subjects of the Portuguese crown. They most certainly identified as Portuguese Jews because that's the only label they applied to themselves. And of course, language. They kept the Portuguese language alive. It was their native language, their language of discourse, and the language in which they recorded their archives through the early 1800s, when you see the Portuguese language acquiescing to Dutch, which is the official government language of the colony, and also acquiescing to Suriname Tongo, which is an Afro-Creole language that developed in Suriname. Next, I realized that the Jewish community of Suriname was part of the frontier communities that were developing in the early modern world at this time. Examples of frontier communities include the Jewish community of Trieste in Habsburg Trieste, or the Jewish community of Livorno, Leghorn. And these frontier communities developed in places where there was no established commerce, there were no Christian guilds, there was no existing power structure, and there was no existing Jewish population. So the authorities setting up these urban merchant centers were trying to attract Jews to come as merchants. And Suriname was very similar to that. It was a frontier community, except that the economy was not primarily a merchant economy. It was, as I said before, an agrarian economy. And what these frontier communities meant is that Jews had power as pioneers, so to speak, as among the initial European settlers of the region, and they could negotiate. They were in a position of power that allowed them to negotiate for an array of privileges that the colonial authorities would bestow upon them. And I've already mentioned a couple of those privileges. They did include, most prominently, communal autonomy, the right to exist as a government within a government, but they also had many other perks as well. And in fact, what I found in Suriname is the privileges accumulated over time, whereas in other parts of the world, the privileges given to Jews could retract, could be rescinded and then given back and retracted. What we see in Suriname, for the most part, is that the privileges, there was an accretion of privileges. They increased over time, again, speaking to the negotiating power of the Portuguese Jewish leaders in Suriname. Finally, my perspective in this book very much wanted to center the voices of the African diaspora. The people who came from West Africa primarily did not bring with them a literacy, a written language. They had very strong oral traditions. Some colleagues from the field of literature refer to this as orature and argue that this should be as important as the literature we study. But as a historian, it was very difficult for me to say very much anything reliable about the African diaspora in Suriname, despite the excellent work that has been carried out by Africanists, precisely because of the asymmetry of the sources. So we have plenty of sources written by the pen of Jews, but we have almost no sources written by descendants of the African diaspora. And what I wanted to find out is, since Jews had the privilege of converting select individuals who were enslaved to Judaism, and also had the privilege of giving the gift of literacy. And I do think literacy can be a gift, especially in this context. Did these individuals from the African diaspora, did they leave a record behind about their experiences of slavery that they were born into, and their experiences as free people of color once they were manumitted, once they were released from slavery? So these were my main approaches and my main influences. So let's go back to some of my ideas that I just shared with you. And in much of this literature that I spoke about, starting in the late 19th century, this historiography written by lay historians and increasingly professional Jewish historians, the Jewish colony of Suriname was described as utopian, and special attention was always given to this village that Jews established in the middle of the rainforest. And they established houses and plantations that surrounded the village, primarily sugar plantations, but also cocoa, coffee, and cotton plantations. And here in this image, if you look at on the right-hand side and you see this structure, this building, which is the highest built point of the landscape, that is actually the Berachavet Malum synagogue, which according to Talmudic law had to be elevated, had to occupy the highest spot in the landscape, and so it did. And I love this illustration because it actually captures exactly what I was attempting to do in my book, and that is I wanted to foreground the voices of the African diaspora. And indeed, in the foreground, you see tent boats. So these were tent boats, riverine, the cars of the era, if you will. So riverine structures in which the master would set sail with his family under the tent, protected from the hot sun, and rowing these structures would be enslaved African men. And I very much wanted to foreground as much as possible, and even to explore the question, is it possible to foreground the African diasporic experience using Jewish archives? So this village was touted over and over again in the sources as a utopian village, as a place where Jews had established a Zionistic settlement, where there was an ingathering of the Jewish exiles, where Jews had self-rule, where they did not suffer from oppression, where there was economic prosperity. So that was one of the myths that I wanted to deal with and I wanted to explode. And indeed, that is what I set out to do in the book. And I found out that actually most of the people, most of the Jewish people living in the Dutch colony of Suriname did not even live in this Jewish village, which is located about 30 miles south of the capital city of Paramaribo. They actually were dispersed through most of the regions of Suriname. And there were only, a few hundred Jews living in Jodensavanne out of a total of perhaps at their peak 1,500 Jews in the early modern period. Secondly, I found out that Jodensavanne was constantly under siege, not only by enslaved Africans who threatened and sometimes actually did rebel and invade the village and try to attack the synagogue, but also the Jewish community was under threat by itself, because many of the citizens of the community did not like the leadership, did not like the Portuguese Jewish leadership, for various reasons, not always stated, and they were constantly staging their own rebellions, usually verbal rebellions and things like refusing to obey authority, but sometimes these rebellions even became physical, involving things like throwing a coconut rind at the chazan, at the prayer leader of the synagogue. So, also, very importantly, the majority of the community of Jodensavanne was impoverished, and indeed the Jews of Suriname, most of them were impoverished. And going through the communal records, I found out that poverty was really the foremost concern of the Jewish leaders. They were trying to deal with poverty management. They were answering petitions from impoverished Jews asking for a piece of clothing to cover their bare flesh, some food, applicants complaining that they were suffering from diseases and could not work. And also these Jewish leaders were engaged in migration management, because during this period, there was an engine of movement that was regulated by a Portuguese Jewish institution known as the despacho. Despacho comes from the Portuguese word despachar, and in Spanish too, despachar, to dispatch in the sense of to send away. And Jewish leaders all over the Atlantic world, Portuguese Jewish leaders, they engaged in a network of mobility management. And they typically, when there was a new arrival who was impoverished, a Jew, they would typically give them money in order to sustain themselves and then try to encourage that person to make their way to another colony or to the metropole. The sooner the better, the further away, the better. And that is because the charity chest, the economic underpinning of the synagogues was under constant onslaught, under economic crisis. And so the Jewish leaders were always scrambling for a way to feed their poor and to regulate the movement of the impoverished. So I think I already kind of debunked the myth in what I just said, that this was a proto-Zionist settlement. I looked at the records that begin in the 1660s, the records that have survived begin in the 1660s, and never did I come across an expression that the village of Jodensavanne was a Zionism avant la lettre, so a Zionism before the rise of modern political Zionism in the late 19th century. There was no such idea, but there were many non-Jewish observers who said, wow, this village is very unusual. It's the only village in the whole world where only Jews lived. So I did see that repeated over and over. And even there, I found that that was not the case, because if you count the enslaved Africans that were resident either temporarily or year-round in the village and who were responsible for the physical upkeep of the village, then arguably the dominant group living in Jodensavanne was not Jewish at all. I also wanted to debunk the myth that Jodensavanne was a refuge for crypto-Jews, for marranos, which is a Spanish word that some people prefer not to use, but which historians generally use interchangeably with a crypto-Jew. And these were Jews who were converted to Christianity beginning in 1391 in Spain and thereafter in Portugal in 1497. And the legislation and also the popular reaction to them was that they were insincere Christians who were practicing Judaism in secret. And one of the myths in the literature is that Jodensavanne was constructed as a refugee for crypto-Jews. And actually, I also found that that was not true. Of course, the people living in Jodensavanne were Portuguese Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews were actually not allowed to live in Jodensavanne. It was a thoroughly Portuguese Jewish residential environment. But the people coming in were not direct refugees from the Iberian Peninsula. They had stopped in the metropoles of Europe, where Judaism was legal starting in the 1590s, and that is Amsterdam, thereafter London, also Bordeaux, and they underwent formal conversion to Judaism in those places. And only then, and often after a lot of meandering throughout the Atlantic world as Jews, only then did they settle in Suriname and in Jodensavanne. And incidentally, the word Jodensavanne means Jews' savannah. Joden means Jews in Dutch. Savannah is actually an Indian word, indigenous word, and it refers to a landscape that is a treeless plain. So that's also important, that these Jews were not living in the rainforest. They were actually living adjacent to the rainforest. They had chopped away part of the rainforest in order to establish their settlement. And Jodensavanne, contrary to the literature, was not an agricultural community. It was a village. It was a residential village. And there was virtually no agriculture going on there. There are some examples of residents experimenting with coffee crops. And of course, Jodensavanne was famous for its floral gardens. But there is no record that I could find that Jodensavanne was producing sugar or other tropical export crops to be brought downriver and to be shipped out of Paramaribo. So Jodensavanne was a village, but it was surrounded by dozens of Jewish-owned plantations, which I will soon talk about. That is all to say that Jodensavanne was no economic hub that historians tried to make it out to be. It was a village that derived its livelihood on petty trade and also the largesse of the community leaders who acquired their wealth through primarily plantation ownership. So in my approach, I devised a new paradigm which I have been following, and I'm very curious to see what other historians think, whether or not the paradigm is viable. But this paradigm centers poverty, migration, and slavery. Now, back in the 17th century, almost the entirety of Suriname as today was covered with rainforests. Today, 90% of the country, of the republic, is rainforest. But beginning in the 17th century, Europeans came in and they started to chop down the banks of the river. The Suriname River was the main artery of the colony. It traversed the colony basically from north to south. And they cleared away the rainforest, sometimes with their own labor power, but most often with the labor power of the enslaved people that they brought from Africa. And they set up plantations, which, as I mentioned before, were primarily sugar plantations, but also coffee, cocoa, cotton, and to some extent, especially in the late 18th century, timber plantations. So if you turned back time and you went to Suriname in the 18th century, you would see that a very large portion of the Suriname River, this is the Suriname River traversing from north to south. The map is quote unquote upside down from a North American perspective, from a Northern Hemisphere perspective, but it is actually very arbitrary where north and south is, of course. And you can see where the circle is. This is the main stretch of the Suriname River where the Portuguese Jewish plantations were concentrated. There were also Ashkenazi owners of plantations, but they did not settle in this region, which again was dominated by Portuguese Jews. You do find some Ashkenazi-owned plantations in other rivers, including the Josdensavanne River, which are tributaries directly east and west on this map that you're seeing. And the Jews gave Jewish names primarily to their plantations. So Portuguese Jewish names, for example, descanso or descanso in Spanish, meaning rest, but also toponyms from the Hebrew Bible, like Ararat and other places that refer to God's interaction with human beings and his promise, especially to the Jewish people, that the Israelites or the Jews would be prosperous. The asymmetry of the project was, for me, the most uncomfortable part of the project, because I don't like writing a narrative where I give short shrift to a people that have such a dominant role in the story. But as I mentioned before, I was really at the mercy of the archives. And so most of what I know about West Africa comes from other historians, not from the archives, although, as I will show you before, the archives that I looked at, primarily written by Jews, shed light on the African diaspora and bring to light things that you really don't find in other archives or in other secondary literature. So most of the individuals who were imported against their will from West Africa came from the region that today stretches from Senegal through Ghana, a region that historians call Senegambia, and a little more extensive than that. And again, 90% of Suriname's population by the late 18th century was both enslaved and of African origin. We know almost nothing about these individuals. We do not know where they came from. We know where their port of departure was, but that says usually nothing about where they actually came from. And the further you go into time, the further the slave trade infiltrates into other parts of West Africa, deeper and deeper eastward. So by the time of the late 18th, early 19th centuries, a person could have traveled 1,000 miles from very deep into West Africa towards Central Africa. And so we really don't know their origins. Slave owners were not interested in their origins. They were not interested in their languages. They were also not interested in their given names. And so in the records, you can find that enslaved people had names that were usually given by the masters, but occasionally you'll also see a Creole name. So you will see in a plantation register, let's say Apollo, also known as Ayaya, for example. And that name in this example, Ayaya, that seems to be a Creole name, an Afro-Creole name. And in fact, Africans, before their departure, many of the cultures had multiple names, not just one name, and they continued that practice in Suriname. Now, the Jews who came to Suriname, as I mentioned before, were leaving from Portuguese regions of the Atlantic world of Europe, primarily from London and Amsterdam. These were the main transit points of the despacho that I was talking about, the main transit points of this migration of Portuguese Jews and to some extent Ashkenazi Jews as well. And they began to settle in the Atlantic world, which had been devoid of Jews for centuries after successive expulsions and exiles and forced conversions and massacres. Jews began to resettle the coast, the Atlantic coast of Europe, starting in the 1590s in Amsterdam, and then later on by the 1650s, legally or semi-legally in London and elsewhere as well, Bordeaux, for example, Bayonne in southern France. The names that these Portuguese Jews gave to their synagogues evinces somewhat of their mind frame. And the American Jewish historian Jacob Marcus thought that these synagogue names convey a sense of messianism. So if we can review them, the synagogue of Rhode Island was known as Nefutse Israel, the dispersion of the Jews, or the dispersion of Israel. In New Amsterdam, which became New York, the name given was She'arit Israel, which means either the hope of Israel, the remnant of Israel, She'ar, remnant. The congregations of both Curaçao and Philadelphia were known as Mikveh Israel, which means either the hope of Israel, as in Tikva, or the ingathering of Israel. And then Beracha V'Salom was the congregation name of Jodensavanne, but also of the congregation of St. Thomas. And Beracha V'Salom is arguably the most unambiguously messianic name for synagogue. And as Jonathan Sarna showed in an email to me, this phrase, Beracha V'Salom, blessing and peace, actually comes from a mystical Jewish text called the Book of Splendor, the Zohar, which was a mystical text that historians date to 13th century Spain. And then finally, Nidchei Yisrael, the oppressed of Israel, or the dispersed of Israel. There are some interesting variations of the translation. All of these names together, Jacob Marcus thought, expressed the idea that the Jews have suffered for a very long time, but now the end of days are imminent, and now they will be rescued by the Messiah, by the Jewish Messiah, and they will be gathered up to their land. And hence, I think that helps to explain why so many historians expected Jodensavanne, Jewissavanne in Suriname, to be a utopian proto-Zionist settlement. So I also looked for signs of messianism in the documents, and I actually found very, very few. And the experience of these Portuguese Jews was not messianic. They were not thinking that they were living on the brink of the Messiah for the most part. They were trying to eke out an existence as impoverished migrants, or they were concerned as landed owners of estates, concerned with managing the people on their property and reaping a profit. So I actually think that Marcus's idea of omni-territoriality is much more on the mark. And that is that the Jews of Suriname, and arguably in the Atlantic world in general, did not see their exile as a punishment, but rather they saw it as an opportunity to forge these new frontier communities, which by virtue of being frontier communities afforded Jews the potential for garnering an array of privileges and economic opportunities. And I think that Marcus is correct there, that these Jews were very much aware that they were living in new communities where Jews had never lived before, or in the case of Europe's Atlantic coast, where Jews had not lived since the 14th through the 16th centuries as a result of centuries of exile, massacres, and forced conversion to Christianity. So going back to Jodensavanne, here's another illustration from the early 1800s of this Jewish village. I found that in the records of the Jewish community that the Jewish authority, so the power that the Jewish people, that the Jewish leaders had to govern themselves, to function as a government within a government, was constantly undermined. It was undermined by slave uprisings. It was undermined by citizens of the community, Jewish citizens, who locked horns with the leadership. But it was also undermined by the colonial government itself, which now and then tried to rescind privileges given to the Jews. And in general, these impulses to rescind privileges came from the Dutch Reformed Protestant Church, which complained that Jews had so many privileges, those privileges outshone the privileges given to Dutch Reformed Christians. And they vocally protested against this and tried to convince the colonial governor to rescind some of the Jewish privileges. For example, the privilege of in the day of the Sabbath, of the Jewish Sabbath, sacred, and not having their enslaved people work on the Jewish Sabbath, and conversely allowing and commanding their enslaved population to work on Sunday, which is the Christian day of rest. This did not sit very well with the Dutch Protestant Reformed authorities. So communal autonomy in this slave society was indeed an unparalleled privilege. I did not find any example in the Atlantic world, or actually anywhere in the world, where the Jews had their own village and where this village functioned as a government within a government. This is true, but if we center poverty and slavery, we find that this was very far from any kind of utopia, and there was constant unrest and a constant threat to the privileges that the Jews had accessed and had secured. So I want to shift now to share with you 2 chapters from my book, which focus on the people of the African diaspora who were part of the Jewish community and who were legally considered Jews. One of the families that I was following was the Pelengrino family. And the Pelengrino family were certainly Eurafrican Jews. So in the records, Eurafrican Jews are referred to as mulattoes or mulatto Jews or Jewish mulattoes in Dutch and Portuguese. So in Portuguese, that would be Judeus mulatos. In Spanish, Judeos mulatos, mulatos judíos. So they call themselves mulattoes or mulatto Jews. And their name was also very distinct, their family name. White Jews did not, as far as I could find, have this last name Pelengrino or Pelengrino. It's spelled in various ways. Pelengrino or Pellegrino in Spanish means pilgrim, but the way that it was used in an early modern context actually referred to a second-class person, a person who was a foreigner. And indeed, that is how it is translated in texts that translate Hebrew into Latin languages. Pellegrino means a foreigner or sometimes a convert. And the Pelengrino family is a very special family because we find the name in West Africa, in the region of Senegambia, where there was a migration of this family under the leadership of Jacob Pelengrino already in the 16th, 17th century, and he set up a trading post in West Africa. His family married into the indigenous community and converted the progeny to Judaism. And this family name is also attested to in London and also in Suriname. And in Suriname, the family name appears not only in the archival records, but also in the cemetery. And during my cemetery work, which started in 1998, 1999 in Suriname, we knew from the archives that there was a plot of former slaves on the margins of the cemetery. And we didn't know where this margin was. So we started to take a metal rod and very superficially stick the metal rod into the soil. And our colleagues did hit stone, and then they realized they uncovered the soil, which had shifted over time. They uncovered the soil, and at a very superficial depth, indeed, they uncovered a stone grave. And this was indeed the mulatto Jewish plot of the cemetery. And we found 2 graves of the Pelengrino family and also some other families that we know are Eurafrican Jewish. So in my book, I depart from my usual usage. I don't use the term mulatto Jew because in a North American Anglophone environment in which I'm operating, it doesn't sit well on the ears. And I very much like the term Eurafrican, although it's not without its own problems, because Eurafrican really combines what I'm trying to get at, that these people had European ancestry. Most of their fathers, or at least their ancestry traced through the father, was a white Jewish plantation owner who had sexual relations with an enslaved woman and produced progeny. But they also obviously had African ancestry by virtue of their matrilineal descent. So I refer to them as Eurafrican Jews. And they occur not only in the open air archive of the cemetery, but also in the archival documents. So you're looking here at a book of ketubot, of Jewish marriage contracts, written in the traditional Hebrew and Aramaic. And I found a handful of these marriage contracts in which both of the spouses were Eurafrican Jews. Now, the document identifies these individuals not as slaves, not as Negroes, not as mulattoes, contrary to some secondary literature, but rather the document refers to them as mishuchrarim, which in Hebrew means manumitted people, former slaves. And according to Jewish law, a manumitted person, strictly speaking, may only marry another manumitted person. Now, these ketubot, these Jewish marriage contracts, are very important. They help us trace the genealogy of these individuals of the African diaspora and the Portuguese Jewish diaspora, but they also tell us something about the material wealth of these individuals. And all of these couples are very moneyed. Their possessions include things like jewels and money and jewelry, but they also include, as part of the bride's dowry, agricultural equipment, and also enslaved human beings. And for me, this was a very important reminder that in a slave society, slavery affects every part of society. And so in many cases, these individuals owned their own family members. And I didn't talk about this in depth in this book, but another article that I published several years ago, I show indeed how many manumitted people came to own their own family members, either for manumission purposes, to eventually manumit them and to treat them as slaves only in name, but not in fact. But I also found other cases where these close family members, so uncles, aunts, siblings, spouses, sexual partners, were treated as bona fide slaves, and they were economically used or exploited, and they were required to bring weekly geld, weekly money that they made, carrying out labor for their masters, who are also their close relatives. And the wills even talk about these slaves as bona fide slaves, and their job description as bringing in money for the family, and that they should be treated as slaves or they shouldn't be treated as slaves. But in either case, it shows that family members were being treated as slaves by manumitted people. I want to also shift to some other documents that I found for this book pertaining to the Pelengrino family. And this is a petition for charity written by Miriam Pelengrino in 1758. She was the daughter of the Pelengrino patriarch of Suriname, Joseph Pelengrino. And her father was known as a very charitable Jew. She actually references his largesse to the community, and she talks about her own indigent status. She's a seamstress, but she hasn't been able to work. And she writes a letter of petition to the Portuguese Jewish authorities of Jodensavanne, and she tries to build her case by taking proof texts from the Bible. So she quotes directly from the Bible or paraphrases from the Hebrew Bible as translated into Portuguese, and she makes a pun on her last name. So she tells the elders of the community, "Não largues o Pelengrino," do not turn away the pilgrim. And also citing, "Não oprimirás o estrangeiro," do not oppress the stranger, quoting from Exodus 23:9, and possibly also alluding to the New Testament, the book of Matthew, which urges its students to give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away, não largues, do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, it should not be surprising that many Eurafrican Jews had proof texts from the New Testament, and as Rivka, the Dutch historian, has shown us, many of these Eurafricans had half siblings that were active in the Christian community, that were members of the Christian church. Because in slave societies, it was very common for individuals to share the same father, but have a different mother. And here is Miriam's brother, Jacob, also the son of Joseph Pelengrino from 1750. And he also quotes from the Hebrew Bible, trying to get charity from the Portuguese Jewish community. And he says in Portuguese, the Holy Law says that you are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. And again, he is punning on his last name, Pelengrino, in the sense of foreigner, and that there should be egalitarianism in the Jewish community. So what's really important about this is that these proof texts were also used when there was a community-wide rebellion against Portuguese Jewish white power. And you can see sort of isolated, small rebellions against the power of the white elites and the second-class status that they gave to Eurafrican Jews. So now and then somebody will protest and say, "Hey, I don't want a second-class funeral for my Eurafrican Jewish leader. I don't want him to be buried in the margin of the cemetery. I want him to be buried in the main part of the cemetery. Enough is enough. I do not want to be isolated in the mourner's bench where people who have lost loved ones have to sit in the synagogue. I want to sit just where I please in the women's section, if I'm a woman, and in the men's section, wherever I please. I don't want to have a second-class status because I am a Eurafrican Jew, because I'm a congregante." That's the term that was used to denote a second-class Jew in the community. But these were just spotty rebellions, and they weren't orchestrated, they weren't organized in a very broad way. But that changed in the 1790s, and members of the Eurafrican Jewish community came together and they launched a full frontal social rebellion against the Portuguese Jewish authorities, arguing that they wanted dignity in their prayer. And that's very significant because, according to sociologists, when people are struggling to find a piece of bread to feed themselves, they're not thinking about dignity typically, they're thinking about survival. But these individuals, they had attained a sufficient degree of wealth so that they didn't have to worry about their day-to-day existence, and they could focus on the insults that they were receiving on a daily basis, the affront that they received socially for being people, Jews of African origin. So they launched a social rebellion against the local Portuguese Jewish community, the authorities. When that doesn't work, they turn to the governor, and the case makes it all the way back to the metropolitan authorities and drags on for years and years. This case, by the way, came to light mostly because of the work of Robert Cohen, who published a very important book called Jews in Another Environment, and it came out in 1991. And he has a whole chapter devoted to this. It's really a sensational case. And in this petition to the governor, the Eurafrican Jews, they again allude to the Hebrew Bible and the law of Moses. And they say, according to the Hebrew Bible, there should be just one law for native members of the congregation, by implication white Jews, but also for the stranger that lives with the congregation, by implication the Eurafrican Jews, Jews of African ancestry. Now, their petition was not successful. And in fact, it backfired. They lost the case. They were not able to get equal rights in the cemetery or in the synagogue. Their status did not elevate. But as I argue in the book, they won the memory battle because they created these archives. And if they hadn't created these documents, if they had not had the gift of literacy, we really would know almost nothing about their case, and certainly nothing about their case from their perspective. Now, they had a house of worship devoted to Eurafrican Jews, which was erected in 1759 with the support of the white Jewish leaders. This was torn down sometime in the 1800s, not because the Jewish leaders commanded it to be, but because of a gradual attrition away from the Eurafrican Jewish community. But the plaza in Paramaribo, the capital city of Suriname, where this synagogue structure once stood, still bears the name of the synagogue. The name of the synagogue, it was really not a synagogue, it was a house of worship, and it was really a society. And the word for society in Portuguese inflected Hebrew is siba or siva. That comes from the Hebrew word yeshiva, which is pronounced as yesiba in Portuguese inflected Hebrew. And here in the sign behind the statue, you can see that the plain, the plaza upon which the house of worship was built, still bears the colloquial name of this house of worship. That is, it is the Plaza of the Siba, the plaza of this Eurafrican Jewish society. And in the foreground, of course, is the very well-known statue that the Netherlands commissioned to show gratitude to the Surinamese people for the aid they gave to the Netherlands during World War II. And those three young women represent the largest ethnic groups of the colony. So people of African ancestry, people of Hindustani ancestry, and people of Javanese, Indonesian ancestry. So just to wrap this all up, why is this? This is a question I kept having to ask myself, and that many of my colleagues were challenging me. And some of them said to me, okay, if Suriname is such an outlier, if its Jewish community is so unusual, why are you studying it? It's not going to shed any light on anything more than itself because it is so unusual. So why are you doing this? So I really had to think deeply about this. And the paradigm of Atlantic Jewish history, and I was able to argue that Suriname, of course, the Jewish community of Suriname is an expression of the broader Atlantic world. It is a place where different populations met, usually within the crucible of violence, and where new peoples were created, usually within this crucible of violence. And that for an understanding of the Atlantic world, the Jewish community is part of that. The Jewish community also preserves voices from the African diaspora that we don't usually hear about in the secondary literature. And in fact, in African diasporic studies, if you look at it from a religious angle, there has been a lot of work on the Christianity of Africans in the Atlantic world, their Christianity, even their Islam. Michael Gomez has written very important work on the Islam that was preserved by enslaved people brought from Africa. But you almost never ever see that Judaism was one of the religious choices or one of the religions thrust upon people of the African diaspora. Finally, from a Jewish communal perspective, Suriname was in a way the heartland of the Jewish Atlantic world. And as I show statistically in an appendix of my book, about 1/4 of all Jews living in the Americas found their home in Suriname. So the story of Suriname is also an important reminder to historians, especially American Jewish historians, that the story of Jews in the Americas is not a story primarily of liberty and freedom. And the literature up till now has argued that the Americas afforded these wonderful opportunities of freedom and egalitarianism for its Jewish immigrants and their descendants. But in fact, that is a very skewed picture. And if we center slave society, we can see that liberty and those privileges and that egalitarianism was always the flip side of the coin of unfreedom, and in the case of Suriname, of slavery.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chazak Baruch. It was really fascinating. I think especially for people within the sort of English-speaking world, Suriname is not necessarily something that we hear very much about. Can I just ask a very quick question, and then I'll shut up and Ton will take over. But the Dutch West Indies Company, it still existed after the Dutch got expelled from Brazil. I think it existed into the late 18th century. I mean, were they around in Suriname, and do the archives of that period sort of survive?
Sure. Well, Suriname was actually governed in part by the Dutch West India Company. And one of the reasons why Jews were able to negotiate for so many privileges is that the colony was not governed by a government. It was governed by three entities: the Van Sommersdijk family, the City of Amsterdam, and the Dutch West India Company. So yes, indeed, they were part of the governing partnership until the late 18th century. And then thereafter, there is a change in the legal structure of the colony.
Thank you. Ton, do you want to take the driving seat?
Yeah. I also have a question myself, and this concerns this Eurafrican. No, it's not an uprising, but petition in 1790. And how far was it inspired by or influenced by happenings in Haiti, America, France, these revolutions that went on there? Can you say something about that?
Absolutely. And so the broader context of the social rebellion is indeed the age of revolutions, when there are all sorts of revolutions, including revolutions of people of African ancestry. You mentioned Saint-Domingue, what became Haiti. And yes, absolutely, there is direct influence. I was not able to find in the archives any mention. I was looking for it for the enslaved uprising of Saint-Domingue, but I was able to provide the contextual context that this was a time of social rebellion, and also a time when the Jewish community was responding to these rebellions by changing its own internal laws, and so gradually abolishing the laws that relegated Eurafrican peoples to a second-class status within the Jewish community. So at some point in the early 1800s, there is no more special burial for Eurafrican Jews in the margins of the cemetery. At some point during that period, Jews may sit anywhere they want. Jews, including those of African ancestry, may sit anywhere they want. And indeed, I think that this age of revolution is the key to understanding why the very scattered, periodic, faint rebellion that happened in a very disorganized and spontaneous way, how that was able to translate into something far more organized. And you have to understand this in the context of the age of revolutions.
Thank you. Now there was some discussion in the chat about the slave trade and the involvement of Jews in the slave trade. I don't know, it's not focus of your book, but could you say something about it?
Of course. So that is correct. I decided not to focus on commerce in this book for a few reasons. One of them is that I thought that in Atlantic historiography, too much emphasis had been given to Jews and the economy. And in fact, virtually the only place that you read about Jews in Atlantic historiography is when you're reading about conversos, who were transatlantic merchants, inter-imperial merchants, and reading about the powerhouse, the powerhouse of the economy that Portuguese Jews were able to create by virtue of their links. And I thought, is that what you're going to reduce Jews to? Just their economic function? It's really important, but there's another story going on here. So I chose to focus on culture. But the answer to your question is, Jews in Suriname, almost none of them were involved in the slave trade. You do find a couple of interesting cases of Jewish ship ownership, and these ships are clearly transporting slaves. but that is the exception to the rule. The slave trade was very precarious, and it is not something that even a risk-taking individual would necessarily dive into.
Okay.
And I also want to say that Eli Faber has written a very important book on this, and that was exactly the question that he asked: to what extent were Jews involved in the slave trade? And he focused mostly on the British Caribbean, the British Atlantic world, but he also found negligible involvement of Jews for the same reason. It was very high risk taking.
Well, there was another question about in how far was slavery tolerated by rabbinic law? Was it justified by rabbinic law? And a related question is, was there opposition to it from Jews' side?
So Catherine Hager has written about this, and Jonathan Schorsch as well. Catherine Hager from an ancient point of view, Jonathan Schorsch from an early modern point of view. And the answer to that, Jonathan Schorsch found no response or literature referring to slavery in the Atlantic world. There could be one exception, but actually that responsum appears to actually be about the Ottoman Empire and not the Atlantic world. There is a responsum recently found at the John Carter Brown Library by Hilit Surowitz, and that responsum talks about a slave ownership, a Jewish master who owns a slave who sires a child, and who does that child belong to? So it's very frustrating, but there is almost nothing in the rabbinical sources that speaks directly to the system of slavery in Jewish communities of the Atlantic world. And there are various reasons for that. And I think one of the most important is that the Jews were not primarily governed by rabbinical law. The leaders of Atlantic Jewish communities were not ordained people. They were wealthy merchants. They controlled the community. They made the bylaws. Occasionally, if they wanted to, they would consult with a chacham, with an ordained minister, with an ordained Jewish leader, or sometimes with a chazan, with a cantor who had some kind of knowledge of halakha, of Jewish law. But in general, their world was a very pragmatic world that was tied into the broader Atlantic economy and the laws of the various metropoles and colonies. So there's nothing, but I also want to say that there is no evidence in any Jewish sources of abolition, that the rabbis were abolitionists, that they condemned slavery, not at all. This was actually part of the world. It was part of the economy, and it was part of the background, and no rabbi, to my knowledge, ever questioned this until the rise of abolitionism in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Well, of course, it rises in 1775 in England, but the rabbinical sources, the ordained rabbis begin to be involved in this debate, but it is not a Jewish debate. It is a debate stimulated by the abolitionism of the late 18th, 19th centuries.
Are there still Eurafrican Jews in Suriname today? Well,
I guess the question is there anybody in the world who would identify as a Eurafrican Jew today? Since I kind of borrowed that term from a historian of West Africa. So, but if you tear that away, another way of asking the question are there Jews who are aware of their African ancestry and of their European ancestry and identify as part of the African and Jewish diasporas? And absolutely, but that is their own story to tell. I would really want to emphasize that. But the argument as a historian that I make in my book is that because of the nature of a slave society, by the early 1800s, the majority of Suriname's Jewish community is itself of African ancestry.
Okay.
Whether they
actually, if I can jump in, though, there was actually a guy from Suriname some years ago who used to come to Bevis Marks, and he was of mixed heritage. Can we just go back because there obviously is a controversial, obviously extremely controversial angle to all of this. Can I just read Mark Levy's comment? Though it has been exaggerated, the participation of Jews in the slave trade as owners of the ships, etc., and as owners of slaves is all well documented and should be acknowledged. I don't think that you're not acknowledging it. I think if I understand, you're saying that seems to be the only subject that a lot of people cover, and that you're trying to contextualize. Is that fair?
Yes, and of course it's a legitimate area of inquiry, and it is an inquiry that Eli Faber took up. Eli Faber, of course, took up the inquiry because of what the Nation of Islam was saying about how Jews dominated the slave trade and were the cruelest of slave owners. By the way, that's a trope that goes back to the historical sources. You can see such accusations already in the 18th and 19th centuries. But for me as a historian, the question is, what really are we studying when we say we're Jewish historians? Are we going to aggregate the Jewish community? Are we going to say, okay, anyone who is legally a part of the community, I am going to look at them through Jewish lenses. And therefore, if they are a ship owner and they have a Jewish last name, I'm only going to understand them through the lenses of Jewish communal membership or influence. Or am I, as a historian, going to engage in disaggregation? Am I going to say, you know what, this slave ship owner, he doesn't have too much in common with the majority of Suriname's Jewish community. He has a lot in common with fellow slave ship owners.
Yeah. Yes,
okay. Another question is, can you briefly address why you do not label this community as Sephardic, but as Portuguese Jewish?
Of course. As I went through the sources, which by the way were recorded sometimes on a daily basis, I gradually realized that this word Sephardic was never coming up. It wasn't coming up from within the community. It wasn't coming up from without the community. It is true that in certain published books of the 18th century, the titles in Hebrew mention, for example, Minhag Sephardim, so the ritual, the religious rite of the Sephardic Jews, but that's only in Hebrew. In vernacular languages, these Jews never referred to them as Portuguese Jews, and they never referred to themselves as Sephardic Jews, and only as Portuguese Jews, and sometimes as Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So I wondered, well, does this have broader relevance? Is a rose by any other name? It smells as sweet, or are these archives trying to tell me something? And I actually settled on the latter point because I found more and more evidence that Portuguese identity was really important to them. It was their vernacular language. It is what connected them to other parts of the Portuguese diaspora, and it allowed them to keep alive their identity with the Portuguese crown, and even on one occasion in the late 18th century from Suriname, to assert their right to repatriation, to go back to Portugal and to be a subject, to become a subject of the new monarchy there.
Thank you. The discussion about slavery is still going on. I think we dwelt on the slave trade is still going on. I'm just scrolling through it. And one of the things somebody said, that you were saying Suriname Jews were not involved in slavery. Please clarify. I think he must have understood you wrong. I think what you said was that Suriname Jews were not involved in the slave trade.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Yeah, okay.
Yes. So everybody was part of the slave economy in a slave system. It was inescapable.
Mm-hmm. And then there was someone who remarked that the Jews in Suriname today live in harmony with all other ethnic populations, and that there is no anti-Semitism in Suriname. I guess you've been to Suriname. Did you? Can you agree with that?
I've been to Suriname on 3 occasions, and of course I have close colleagues who live there and who are from there or who have migrated to the Netherlands. But this is really not my story to tell. I could share with you my anecdotes, and indeed that is something I was really interested in as a visitor and a researcher. For example, I think Paramaribo is the only or one of the only places in the world where you have a synagogue right next door to a mosque. That did not escape my attention. And I could say a lot about this and my experiences, but I don't think it's my story to tell because I'm not a travel writer or a journalist. And I would like the Surinamese people to speak for themselves.
Fair enough.
May I ask another question? And Mark is still not entirely content with the answer, and that's fine because people are allowed their own opinions. Can I ask who was actually involved with the transportation of slaves to Suriname? Were these sort of individual Dutch merchants, Portuguese Jewish merchants, or don't we know? I mean, obviously later the English had the asiento, the Spanish monopoly.
That's right. So yes, there were European factors set up along the coast of West Africa. The merchants participating in the slave trade were both people indigenous to Africa and also of Eurafrican descent, and of course, for the most part, people from Europe, multi-ethnic people, multi-religious people. And it's been well documented. It was not the focus of my work, but you can look at the works of Willem Klooster, for example, who happens to be my husband, and Jonathan Israel. There are many people who have dealt with this, and I'm not really one to speak about it.
Well, in a sense, Jewish plantation owners who bought slaves were involved in the slave trade in the sense that they bought them.
There's a distinction between slave trade and purchase of slavery. It is a commercial distinction.
Yeah.
It's up to you how you want to define it. It's fine, but the literature, the historical literature makes a distinction between the slave trade and the purchase of slavery for the purpose of domestic and field labor.
Yes. A personal question again. You mentioned the archives a lot. And I know that the Dutch archives have been very diligent in digitizing them for all of us. Could you tell us a bit about that? Were you involved in this?
The digitization of the archives has been going on for several years, and the digitization was part of a pact between the colonial authorities and the colony of Suriname and the metropolitan authorities. As I understand it, it was an agreement that exists in writing dating to the early 20th century, that one day we will return these archives that were produced in Suriname, we will return them back to the colony. And with the rise of the technology, that is digitization, this was all possible. And I think it was in January 2017 when the ceremony occurred in The Hague and there was an official handing off of the documents. The documents were repatriated to Suriname. So the originals are in Suriname, they're in the National Archives of Suriname, and copies were made, of course, and are democratically available. And one of the wonderful things about the projects is it is involving the democratization of knowledge. So these digitized documents, they are available to everybody who has internet access and a computer, and they are free. And
Thank
knowledge
you.
On Facebook, Ava is mentioning a paper by Jonathan Elaza de Mota. I don't think he's here today. Who's if people don't know him, he's from the Dominican Republic, and he's written a paper on this subject, which is probably quite relevant. Also, sorry, Daniela was asking about Jews owning Christian slaves, which is quite an interesting question. What was that allowed, and therefore, presumably, if it wasn't, then what would stop slaves becoming Christians to get their freedom?
Yes, so Suriname was distinctive in that it did not share, the colonial leaders did not share their language and culture with a majority society. You see the same thing on Curaçao, by the way, another Dutch colony. That is to say that the government, the colonial government, was not interested in converting the majority population to Dutch Reformed Protestantism. And people of African descent were left to their own devices, and they could practice their own indigenous traditions or create their new ones, their new Creole religious traditions. And that is exactly what they did.
Yeah.
And so the majority society follows what is today called Winti, and probably has many other names. And you know, whether it's whether you can even call it a religion is also a question, because religion is a concept forged in the West. Would you be more comfortable saying spiritual tradition? I'm not quite sure. So the answer to the question is that, to my knowledge, there were no Christian slaves among the people owned by Jewish people in Suriname. They followed the Afro-Creole traditions. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, if they had converted to Christianity, they might have a legal case for coming out of ownership by a Jew.
I think we could go on for another hour.
Yes.
There are a lot of thank yous in the chat. And we had our maximum of 100 viewers, which is a record in itself. And I would like to thank you very much for your talk. I learned something today, and I look forward to reading the rest of your book.
Well, thank you so much for hosting this. And I also want to say to everybody who is listening, thank you for your interest. And I really encourage you to continue the conversation, start new conversations. This is a story that hasn't really been delved into, and there's so much work to be done and so much archival research to be done. The key to history is perspectives. So the more perspectives, the better. So keep up your interest and keep up your good work.
Thank you very much. And next week we're trying to go and have a second round table, but to focus specifically on the Portuguese nationality laws. That it's just been suggested that these be reformed, and I'm trying to persuade a member of the Portuguese National Assembly to join us. But if anybody has any particularly strong feelings about if the law is a good idea, bad idea, if they have applied to Portugal or to Spain, or have any thoughts and wish to perhaps share their thoughts for 5 minutes with the group, then please get in touch with Ton and myself, because we'd be very grateful to hear from you. I'm afraid I forgot to make the slides to put up at the end, but if you look online for Aviva's book, Jewish Autonomy in a Slave Society, then you can find this, and obviously we highly recommend it, both to yourselves and to the various Jewish genealogical societies and historical societies and other groups to which you may belong. This venture is only sort of possible due to support of our patrons, and I can see a lot of them are here today, and we thank you very much. And if anyone else wants to become a patron, just go to the Patreon website and put in the word Sephardi. And Ton, would you like to close the meeting for us?
Close the meeting for us. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Aviva. Thank you, everyone, for attending this meeting. And thank you for the lively discussion in the chat. And we hope to see you. We hope to see you next week, same time. And Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Goodbye to everyone. Thank you.